This is a story of two brothers, two fourth-generation white Fiji islanders. For much of their lives, they lived away from Fiji. Yet one brother always had a longing to return. It was like a call. But Fiji had changed. And that longing was to lead to tragedy.
We leave tonight with a horrific double homicide in one of Suva's most prominent suburbs. It's believed one of those dead is the director for the Fiji Red Cross, John Scott, along with an unidentified European male.
The house belonged to John Scott, the director of the Fiji Red Cross. Some police officials described the scene as a site of horrific violence.
Police swooped on a neighbourhood not far from the house where the bodies of the two men were found, hacked with a cane knife.
The person is now in our custody, is a Suva resident and was also an associate of the two deceased persons.
The murders of my brother John and his partner Greg caused me to leave London, where I'd been living, and move back to the Pacific. I needed to make sense of the murders, and I needed to make sense of my family's long history in Fiji. In fact, I needed a better understanding of Fiji itself, both as it was and how it is now. A good starting point was a visit to the graves of my great-grandfather and father, buried in a remote spot in the bush near the village of Coup. I had to seek permission for the visit in the traditional manner. You'll have to excuse me. I'm a Kaiviti in my heart, but I'll have to speak like a Kaivalangi. I wish I could speak Fijian like my brother and my father did. I remember coming here as a child with my father a lot, and my father, he always instilled in my brother and me my family's links with the Fijian people and taught me to respect you very much. Well, the last time I was here, I was standing on either side of my father's grave with John. So that was 1977. My great-grandfather, the Reverend William Weir Lindsay, arrived in Fiji in 1871, and he's buried on the site of the Missionary Training Institute he once headed. Eventually, he became the chairman of all the Methodist missions in Fiji. In those early colonial days, This was a good Christian man in the midst of buccaneers and pioneers. And they would have known that river, the Nakelo River, that we came up very well, because that's how they used to get back into Suva, in punts rowed by oarsmen. That's one thing to be buried here, but my father decided to be buried here as well. So just to be difficult. The house that John and I grew up in was built by my father in the 1950s, with a large open veranda looking out over the whole of Suva Harbour. My earliest memories are of parties by the pool, dogs, parrots, and large tropical gardens, and the Fijian staff whom I was very close to. I remember my father always saying to us, this was the best view in the world.
So, Owen, did you always feel the Scots belonged in Fiji?
Oh, very much so. John and I were brought up to feel very responsible about our connection with Fiji, the fact that we were born here. And our father, Morris, put us under quite a lot of pressure to continue the so-called Scot legacy.
As far as a young fellow like myself was concerned, he had a kind of heroic image. He had gone away to the Second World War and joined the RAF and had got a DFC. So we held him on a little bit of a pedestal, but we also knew that he was a real playboy. He loved the girls and had a lot of time with the girls, and we heard of a few illegitimate children that he had. He wasn't disparaged for that. He was held as one of the lads and held in high esteem for his ability to do that and get away with it.
John and I were the children of the two marriages that my father had with my mother. So my parents married, divorced, married again, and divorced once more. So John was a child of the first marriage, and I was a child of the second marriage.
Was he a bully, Morris?
Oh, yes.
Were you frightened of Morris?
Well, we led a very public life, socially. Locally at home, it would be very difficult. When Fenner came on the scene, it was a bit difficult. If we went out to party or anything, it would be Morris Scott and his two wives. I knew I'd have to get away somehow.
Yeah.
That was when I started trying to get away.
Yes.
My parents divorced for the second time in the 1960s. My mother finally got away from my father, and John and I ended up moving with her to New Zealand. It was a change in circumstance as well as country. Life was quite tough by comparison to what we'd been used to. But each summer there'd be a taste of the old life again when John and I would return to Fiji for the Christmas holidays. My father was now married to the woman who had been his mistress, Fenagati, the other wife, as my mother used to call her. She was glamorous and wealthy, and we used to spend several weeks each year on her private island, Katawhanga. Sun, sea, sand and fishing, all the things that boys love. Those were pretty special times, in spite of what we had to deal with in terms of our father's behavior. My father was very hard on my brother. He taunted him quite a lot. And this was usually fueled by alcohol. So there would often be circumstances where we were out in the car and my father would be telling my brother to go faster, faster, you know, don't be a queen. This was the type of behavior that my father indulged in.
John left here in the 60s. we were still British, we were still colonial. Suva was a European town. It was a white place. Not only was it run by Europeans, there were whole suburbs of Europeans running the government. Even bank tellers were Europeans. Fijians were not allowed to come in freely until about 1966. So, you know, it was a white place.
Well, of course, the European families during the colonial days led a very privileged life. They enjoyed privileges that the indigenous people and Indians did not have. They formed, of course, part of the commercial life of Fiji, particularly in Suva, and also the professional life and the lawyers, such as the Scots.
My grandfather and my grandmother lived in a rather beautiful house in Suva called Hokum. They used to entertain lavishly there, parties and lunch parties on Sundays. My grandmother was famous for her entertaining on a Sunday.
We were at the top of the pile. The Fijian people were considered lazy buggers. They really didn't have any prospects at all. And the Indians were considered mere labourers.
After Fiji became a British colony in 1874, sugarcane was planted as a cash crop. A workforce was needed, so the colonial administration brought in indentured labour from one of Britain's other colonies, India. The Indian population rapidly grew, and so too its voice. Before long, Indians began to question colonial rule. Indigenous Fijians, for the most part, did not work on the plantations. Instead, they continued to live a traditional community-based way of life centered on the village.
Well, I think in the colonial times, the Europeans certainly aligned themselves with the Fijians. Yeah. And that was partly because Indians were agitating for democracy, for equality, and that was seen as a threat and seen as unacceptable to the European elite. But they could deal with the Fijian majority.
Indigenous Fijians generally were comfortable with colonial rule. An unspoken alliance developed between Fijian chiefs and the European elite. There was a shared fear of what was perceived as the growing political and economic power of the Indian community. My father became involved in the Fijian nationalist movements of the 1950s and 60s, very much on the Fijian side of things. Then in 1970, Fiji became independent, although most indigenous Fijians wanted the country to remain a colony. The Fijian and Indian populations were by now roughly equal in number.
Well, I think there's always been an implicit belief or understanding on the part of Fijians that while Indians can live and work in Fiji and prosper, that Fijian political control should always remain in their hands.
There was a great feeling of euphoria at the time. And for the early years, we progressed very, very well. And I think Fiji was one of the few countries in the world that had gained their independence without any war or any revolution. It was done in a very amicable way.
During this period of change in Fiji, John and I were still living in New Zealand. I was studying law and John was in business. Our father had died in Fiji 7 years after independence, and John and I probably saw ourselves as being settled in New Zealand. John had married and he had had a son, Piers, but then when Piers was still quite young, the marriage ended. There was some surprise when John met Greg, but their friendship soon developed into a long-standing relationship. In Fiji, tensions between Fijians and Indians began once more to escalate. And in 1987, Lieutenant Colonel Sitiveni Rambuka staged Fiji's first coup.
87 was a turning point because an Indian-backed party won government. Rambuka, believing that there was a risk that Fiji would be taken over by the Indian community because they had dominance in the economic sector, and now they had dominance in government. And so Rambuka was able to foment that belief into the coup.
John and Greg were actually in Fiji when the 1987 coup occurred, renovating the house that John and I had inherited from our father. It was empty and had fallen into disrepair, and John feared that it might be taken over by the military. So John and Greg decided to sell up in New Zealand and begin a new life in Fiji. And this is where there were a lot of parties in my father's day. A lot of drinks parties, lots of fun. Very colonial, white mischief days.
Just out of the blue, John and Greg turned up. And I must admit, when I saw Greg, it was like, oh, okay, all right, so John's now like that, that's fine.
I knew Greg. Oh, God, who didn't? He was gorgeous. Greg was gorgeous. I remember when he first arrived in Fiji, the women were like, oh, my God, have you seen so-and-so? I was like, forget it.
My husband and I both realized at the time that they came because they needed to speak to somebody that they could trust about them coming back home again. Because they were in a relationship, they were going to live openly in Fiji, and it was very new, and it was something that really wasn't done at the time. Greg had a lot of bravado about it. Oh, it doesn't matter. But
you wouldn't have known.
No, but John was very concerned because the Scott family were an old family. So we just said to them, look, it is new, but you're obviously not going to go out there and be all, in people's face about it. Just get on with your life like everybody else.
John saw himself as an insider. I always got the feeling that he believed he'd come home, but a lot had changed. It was a completely different country. All of the people who lived here had no memory of the Scots. And so all the average person on the street saw were two white men.
Since Rambuka's 1987 coup, poverty had worsened in Fiji. My brother had always had a humanitarian streak, so when the opportunity to work in an aid organization arose, he was happy to leave the corporate world behind.
I was president of the Red Cross, and we were faced with finding a new Director General. So we went on a hunt and advertised for the position, and one of those who applied was John Scott. There were some on the board of Red Cross at the time who didn't believe John would be the appropriate person because he was known to be gay at the time. So we had a little bit of a tussle within the board over that issue, but eventually our view prevailed and John was duly appointed the Director General. And he came in and he grasped the nettle and really did a fantastic job. He was good at fundraising, and he introduced a number of very effective fundraising events, such as the ball, the fashion parade, and really built up the image of Red Cross to a point it had never been before.
They were really like role models to most sort of gay men. I remember once there was a gay men sort of meeting at the back bar of Traps, and a lot of people turned up because they wanted to meet John and Greg, because they were these sort of rich white people who had this big house on the hill. They went to all the fancy parties. We'd see them shaking hands with sort of dignitaries in the newspaper. So yeah, they were huge. They were real role models in the community, and it's important for young people who saw them like I did to sort of kind of get to know them.
Because that's so true. Yet there were other times, maybe it was just their personal choice, I don't know, but there were times when they attended functions together, John and Greg, but both of them took a female partner.
Things were categorized for John and Greg. They had this category of friends here, compartmentalized. There was the family ones, the ones with kids and that were husbands and wives and in heterosexual relationships. Then there were these other compartments that we knew were there, but I didn't want to know about it, and I certainly didn't want them to share any of that with me, but they never, ever brought that life into our life.
Then in May 2000, there was another coup, once again in the name of Fijian nationalism, and once again arising out of the perceived threat of Indian political and economic power. This coup was much more violent than the one in 1987, the one that had indirectly brought John and Greg to Fiji in the first place.
Suva, a city in crisis.
The country's prime minister is being held hostage by armed rebels.
Desperate kidnappers in Fiji threaten to kill the elected prime minister.
We have executed a civil coup on behalf of the indigenous peoples of Fiji.
The coup occurred because this group of men were able to convince suspicious indigenous Fijians who feel disenfranchised economically, politically, etc., and in a sense marginalized economically, were able to manipulate them to stir up unrest for their political and economic gains.
Moments earlier, 2 gunshots were heard from the parliamentary complex. The police are not able to tell us anything. They are not able to go into the parliamentary complex themselves. Scenes reminisce of the 1987 coups. It's like nothing has changed since then.
I was in England when I first heard about the coup, the 2000 coup. And at first it was very difficult because we didn't have any contact with John. And then I discovered that on the first day, I think it was, he had walked up alone to the gates of the parliamentary complex.
And I must confess that I arrived at the gates there in a nervous state, to say the least. The guards were standing there with their machine guns. I approached them and explained that I was from the Fiji Red Cross Society and that I needed to have access to the hostages.
So security, back inside.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. George, say something?
No, please, don't test the situation. Please go ahead. No, go ahead.
The Indian Prime Minister, Mahendra Chaudhry, was taken hostage, along with members of his government.
They're not legitimizing anything, okay? That's fine.
To walk into a military/civilian coup with military personnel, some of them holding guns, and civilians who had never had any training with guns, in a mob mentality environment, to be able to have the guts to walk in. You'd be crazy.
You had a large group of people who'd come down from the hills who were persistently drunk, either on alcohol or kava or their own adrenaline, who were running around with submachine guns and pistols and goodness knows what. Anyone who went into that parliament was at risk, and John was certainly at risk.
Look, I could easily have shot all these people, okay? Don't forget the cause for which we acted. And plus, I'm talking Fijian to Fijian, and I don't expect the Europeans amongst this international press corps to understand that.
I made an endeavor to go to the hospital to pick up medicines that were required, because you have to remember that Suva had been looted and burned that day. Driving around the streets was a nightmare, to put it mildly. The streets were full of drunken young people with supermarket trolleys full of liquor. These people were irrational, lying on the road, trying to get in the way, trying to get rides. from vehicles such as mine, so it was very awkward.
Because of him, they got hope. I mean, I can't imagine what they must have been thinking. They'd be killed and so on and so forth. I remember that scene where, you know, George Speight took Chaudhry out into Parliament grounds. He held a gun to his head and threatened to shoot him. Can't imagine what that must have done to the members of Parliament who were watching that, and what John must have been thinking, watching that, thinking, where's this going to go?
The link that we have between the hostages and the families has become obviously increasingly important. So we will maintain that, and we will endeavour to keep their suffering to a minimum. It was in this period that we went through the uncomfortable situation of receiving 3 death threats. The words we used were, tell him that if he puts his white face anywhere near this complex, we will shoot, and we will shoot to kill.
I remember having a phone conversation with him in London in which he said, I can't do this anymore. And I could hear his voice cracking up, and it was very strange to be in London to say to him, yes, you can, you can carry on.
John, to be able to go through and be the link between the hostages and their families, and to just come out and help, to be able to do that. Only someone that was sent by God can do that.
John Scott was the angel that brought the light every day to us.
I'm embarrassed because there are people up there who keep lifting up my T-shirt looking for the stubs of the wings.
Yes, to liberty and freedom,
Without the backing of the army, the coup failed and the hostages were released. In a surreal scene, George Speight shook hands and posed with the very people he had locked up and intimidated for 56 days. Reality was quite different. The endgame in the conflict was yet to be played out. In the process of looking again at my family's past, I decided to visit the Grand Pacific Hotel, partly because it was one of my father's watering holes. But when we went to film there, to our surprise, we found the GPH had been taken over by the military. The tensions behind the crisis in 2000 had never been resolved, and they erupted again in 2006, resulting in another coup. This hotel, once the epitome of colonial elegance, was now a military camp. In the early 20th century up to the mid-20th century, it was a very chic hotel. And I mean, you had royalty that came here. The Queen stayed here in 1954, I think it was, on her royal tour, the coronation tour. And some of the rich people in Fiji, too, that used to, the planters, they would always, when they came into town, they'd stay here. It was very chic. And then when they used to have banquets, there'd be these long refectory tables. It was very grand. I want to have a look in one of the rooms. Look at that. Here's a stateroom, and there's a pup tent in there. I mean, it's sort of bizarre.
The Queen wouldn't have stayed in a pup tent.
There's another pup tent. It's just, incredible. Let's have another look. Soldiers remained on the streets long after the 2006 coup had taken place. Unlike the crisis in 2000, which was more renegade, this coup was planned and executed by the army, headed by its commander, Commodore Frank Bainimarama.
The military has taken over the government, has executive authority, and the running of this country.
Fiji's changed hugely since my father's day, but it's not politics or nostalgia that's brought me back. In trying to understand my brother's death, I felt I needed to meet the family of Apete Kaisau, the man who had committed the murders. I wanted to hear what the family had to say. I'm not entirely comfortable with it, I have to say, but I feel obliged to be there, to meet them and hear what they have to say. I mean, for the purposes of this film, I understand that's okay. I'd only met the Kaisau family once before, just briefly at the time of the trial.
I want to be seen with him. Last time we met was how many years ago?
Oh, it's 2003. In the courtroom, I know.
That's right.
It was a difficult time for you?
Yes.
Difficult time for all of us.
Yes, that's right. It's good we meet again.
It is.
For me as a mom, my training that I gave to Apete was for him to be an independent and confident young man. He achieved that in his early teens, and he was a great rugby player, right from primary school.
Our true forte as a family is our deep religious convictions. That was tested during that time, and we came through. So you can imagine how influential the church is in our lives.
I can remember when I was a child that's the thing that we do every day, even if it means missing the school bus. We made to sit down and do our prayers before we go to school. Yeah, and in our bringing up, so very important. That was a driving force. And I'm just telling the congregation that you're here to film a documentary, and I was telling them that this is the church that Apete was brought up in. He used to attend Sunday school here, and this is the church that he attended every Sunday, and what made him did what he did, because he believed there's a God that's going to help him. There's a God that's close to his heart, and he believes that God started what he did, and he's going to end it for him. So thank you for coming. Thank you for having a good heart to film a documentary on Apete's family, the Scots family, and the people that made an impact on Apete's life.
I don't really know how Apete first came to meet John and Greg. His cousin Zachariah lived at Tamavua village, near to the house, and villagers would often work at the house just as they had in my father's day. Maybe Apete helped out in the garden, and over time some sort of relationship developed.
Apete Kaisau was a very strong part of their household, Greg and John's. There was a lot of interaction and everything, and weekends away and all sorts of things, but he moved freely in and out of their houses, on the properties, the boat, everywhere. He had full access to everything.
There is a Fijian proverb, "Vana vana nabula," which means you're trying to get to the moon. You're trying to get things that in reality you're not able to. And I believe Apete was, he expected a lot in life, but to get to that expectation, it was not there.
The white man and the local, the younger local, present a dilemma for the average person here, because they immediately perceive that it's the power of the money and the material comforts that attracts the local person to do something that they would not otherwise do.
A large number of Fijian men think nothing of having sex with other men, but they don't regard themselves as gay. I mean, you know that, right? I mean, that's true in a lot of places. And they don't regard themselves as puftas, as they would say, right? Or gauri. They don't regard themselves as gauri. The one receiving is the gauri, not them. They're macho.
In this country, there's a lot of promiscuity. so long as it's hidden, so long as those in charge or those outside your circle don't know, it's okay. But you don't wear it on your sleeve. And that was what John and Greg were doing.
You've got to put this in a context. There has been a definitive move to right-wing Christian fundamentalism from the '87 coup. Rambuka ground, his constituency was the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church has slowly and surely moved towards fundamentalist Christianity. So even if there was a degree of tolerance at one stage, or more like turning a blind eye than tolerance per se, not like social tolerance in the wider sense of the word, they've become less and less tolerant because of Christianity.
Oh, we cause hurricanes and poverty.
Yes, that's the
My
best.
favorite
Wow.
quote, the Methodist, two different presidents of the Methodist Church said that once we cause poverty, God would look down upon Fiji and see this deviant behavior going on and would cause the country to become impoverished. And the other one said that we would then bring in like bad weather.
Yeah, and if they thought about it, we probably caused us to lose the Sevens title as well.
Yeah.
But we haven't thought about that one yet.
There was a perception that John and Greg were not of here. And in addition to the homophobia, there's a kind of xenophobia and justified by a protective kind of impulse. You know, we must protect ourselves from these corrupt and corrupting outsiders.
I understand there came a point when John and Greg tried to put a bit of distance between themselves and Apete Kaisau. And it was around this time that Apete went to New Zealand to try and become a professional rugby player.
When he went, that was part of our 21st birthday gift to him. He turned 21. Yeah, and then we said, okay, why not? Let's give him a trip to go to New Zealand.
He started from number 7, then drifted to center, fullback and wing. Then they found out that he was lethal in the fullback. He could run the whole field, pick up the ball underneath the goalpost hand on the other side of the try line.
Very quiet, but extremely polite. Loved the kids.
He looked after the kids just like his own sisters.
Helped out in the garden. Loved working around outside. Yes, he was a really nice young man, but very quiet.
They called him the White Angel.
During the coup, everything changed. We were sitting down here and he saw that and his face changed.
During Fiji's last military.
I'm embarrassed because there are people up there who keep lifting up my T-shirt looking for the stubs of the wings.
Everything changed. It was sort of like Saturday, I don't want to go rugby now. I'll just stay home. And I said, hang on. I said, there's people there expecting you to be there. I don't care. So that's it. He just go back downstairs and close his door, and that was him.
There was a lot of times he was spending downstairs in his room, whereas before he used to come up and be part of the family and sit and watch TV or talk, but then he started to be in his room. Oh, no, I'm reading, that's all right, you know, and he'd have food and disappear again.
It was a totally different Apete. From being a loving person to sort of angry to himself.
We did find a piece of paper in a book which said an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and it was printed out on a piece of paper.
He did suggest about hating gays. He said, I don't like gays. I said, these people should be dissolved on earth. That's what he said, I don't like gays. They shouldn't be alive.
I last saw John in 2001, January of 2001. I'd gone down to Fiji for Christmas. There was Piers, John's son, and my mother. And we went across and stayed with John and Greg.
We got on well, and we used to go out in John's boat, and of course Piers would be there. And we were all quite a happy family.
John was more relaxed by that stage. Earlier, and I saw him about 4 months after the coup, and he was still shell-shocked. He was traumatized, really. I think some would say that he had post-traumatic stress disorder, really. But that last holiday was a good one. At least we have good memories of how close we were that last time we were together. In 2001, Apete suddenly left New Zealand and returned home to Fiji without warning.
One Sunday evening, we came back home, and there he was sitting on the veranda. He didn't say a word. I said hello to him.
He was just sitting there, and then, hey, Petty, hello. Oh, like a mother greeting the son after 2-3 years away. He was just sitting there, hello. And I was really confused whether it was Petty or his ghost, whatever. And I went back inside, and I was frightened. But that was not the son that I knew.
He usually likes to walk. He usually walks at night, at 2-3 o'clock in the morning. He likes to walk by himself. I heard a call from home. They said, Apete is here. And I told them, I'm walking, tell him to wait tomorrow morning. And it's about 9-10 o'clock that night, he came down to me. I'm a Christian, I'm a committed Christian. We were conversing, and it's a bit of an argument, and I was telling him about the New Testament. The New Testament involves Jesus Christ, and he was died on the cross, and the Old Testament involves sacrifices of lamb, of beast for the cleansing of our sin. He asked me a few questions about John, and when I was sharing Bible verses to him, he told me that same verses, Bible verses, you should go and share it to John Scott and Greg. Go, why is that? Because if you didn't do anything, I will do something. That's what he said that night. Exactly what he said that night. He already put the weapon there at our house there. Somewhere there, he hid the weapon somewhere here. That night. Then he went down, take that shortcut into John's house.
My brother was having a cup of tea here at about 6:30 on July the 1st, 2001. And he saw the killer coming up the stairs there with a cane knife. And he was chased back into the house. He tried to lock the doors, tried to get on the telephone, but he wasn't quick enough. And then after that, there was a struggle, which was violent. And not only were John and Greg killed, but they were effectively beheaded as well. Well, in that moment, your life changes forever. It's like you've been branded. It's like you have a mark on your skin in a secret place that very few people will ever see. And then it was just an extraordinary time. I just knew it was going to be very difficult and a long time to get to Fiji. It was going to take us three days to get there. My immediate response was the fact that I was really torn in terms of responsibility, because I had an elderly mother in New Zealand and I needed to make sure that somebody was looking after her.
I was able to help in a little way in blocking the curious and encouraging our local newspaper not to spread it over the local press, and to allow you a little privacy and also allow you support.
We received the news with absolute shock. Shock that somebody so close to us could be so brutally murdered. Shock that it was right next door to us, more or less.
It just floored me, really floored me. I remember my mother breaking down and crying as well, because she was very close to Greg. But for myself, the first thing I thought of was, this has got to do with his role in the Red Cross and something to do with the coup.
To be quite honest, I thought it was a robbery gone wrong. Because there were struggles with a lot of families after the coup of 2000.
The most likely thing was that extreme disapproval by some bizarre person of their lifestyle.
I thought that it was a fuck buddy gone wrong.
Well, I suppose I made an assumption it was something to do with his sexuality that had led to this. I mean, we'd heard rumours of all sorts of parties and functions up there that were risky, and I suppose we weren't all that surprised that something like this had eventually occurred, but not to the extreme brutality of it, as we subsequently found out.
Fijians don't normally take a cane knife and just chop somebody up, you know. At least at this time, okay. Cannibalism was there before Christianity came, but that's gone. But this is a new thing, a new and terrible horror. It's horrible.
In a repressive space, that's the most extreme form of punishment for being gay here, and so that stayed with me for a long time.
In the possibility that you could be killed?
Oh, yes, definitely.
You were losing sleep, weren't you?
Yeah, it was scary for all of us. Friends of mine were being called John on the street. Well, hey, John Scott, they'd call us. So it was almost like a warning. That's how we were feeling at the time. It was like, well, keep on behaving like that. This is what happens to people like you. That's the feeling we were getting from the community.
It was a premeditated murder, that's what we're being told. They went in, busted the door down, killed the two, and then ran back out, throwing the knife in a nearby bush and I think a piece of cloth with some blood on it.
He told me, there's a breaking news at 12 o'clock. That John Scott and Greg Scrivener murdered. What? He touched me and he told me, I did that, he said. I didn't believe him. So that's a Sunday, and whole of that time, he was asking me, a cousin in Fijian, we used to call his father Tavale. And he called me, Tavale, do you believe me? And I said, Tavale, I didn't believe it.
And right on the screen, I was going, man, this could be him. It was funny that when I get to think of it now, why, out of everything else, that it dawned to me that it was Apete. Now, when I talk about it, and I said, you know, I believe that it was God telling me that it was him, and it never was wrong. And a couple of days later, the police came home. When I saw the police truck, I just wept and I said, this is it. I was not wrong when it struck me when I was watching the news. Yeah. So when I came in there, she asked me, Mom, haven't you heard? I said, heard what? Haven't you heard that they are looking for Apete? And then, you know, I wasn't ready for that. And then she had to tell me what happened. That the police were looking for him because he's a suspect.
The person is now in our custody, is a Suva resident and was also an associate of the two deceased persons. We took him out to the crime scene, and what he told us, and as he took us through step by step, was very much consistent with what happened on the Sunday morning.
He was there with a group of police officers. And then, you know, just out of the blues, I just started crying heavily when I saw him. Then he said, Mom, don't cry, Mom, don't cry. He told me, don't cry twice. So I just stopped. You know, why he was telling me not to cry when I was really pouring myself out. And I just looked at him, and that was it. Those were the tears that I shed after I met him when he was taken in as a suspect.
I had time to speak to him. I think it was bold. He was very bold to come out with it. And he said, you know, what I did it for the good of the nation. I did it for the young generation because whatever they were doing was wrong. It's more than wrong. I don't think he has any regrets for what he did. I mean, he's asked for forgiveness. Yes, he's asked for forgiveness. Yes. Yeah.
Savua, he basically was the spin doctor that got the newspapers to behave in the way that they did, because he said, oh, well, apparently the killings took place at, and he said the certain time, and then he was quiet for a while, and he said, well, there was a lot of illegal activities happening at the house, and then the question started flying, what illegal activities? And then he started with all the videotapes believed to be homemade pornography, the white powder believed to be cocaine.
And photos, as well as more of an unidentified white powder in a search of the men's Suva home today.
People were focusing on the good side of Mr. Scott and his partner, Greg. But then people tend to forget that he's a practicing homosexual. I don't profess to understand everything about homosexuality. It's just that they tend to be more vicious than the normal heterosexual relationship.
Yes, scary.
I mean, in his allegations, what do you think his message was, Savua? What do you think he was saying?
They deserved it.
They deserved it. They're good
That
people.
was
They
the
behaved terribly.
resounding message. They deserved what happened to them.
Yeah. My God, this guy's justifying the death. He's justifying the killing in a very subtle and not so subtle way sometimes. I mean, Savua might as well have been a pastor, you know, with a white collar at his throat investigating.
In the end, the white powder was baking soda that was used to clean silver. And also the police said that they'd found pornography at the house, which included some incredibly boring holiday videos of mine. And a month later, they publicly stated that they had not found any pornography at the house.
The opportunity to paint John and his partner as sexual predators was one that the media lapped up. So, you know, sexual predators preying on vulnerable youths in the Tamavua area, that sort of thing, they would lap it up.
And it deflected attention away from, has a crime been committed, collect the evidence, prosecute the offender, gain a conviction.
Once again, it comes back to the acceptance of homosexuality. If there is an acceptance of homosexuality in the country, the police would have presented a more understanding picture to the media, and the media would then be the mouthpiece to the general public.
There are some who could not accept the way that John lived, but his long relationship with Greg was about the universal things in life that we all crave: trust, intimacy, companionship, and above all, love. Too often people concentrate on differences when they should be looking instead at similarities. May John's memory be a unifying one for all people in Fiji, particularly at this time. After John's funeral, I returned to England, and from there tried to keep in touch with various officials in Fiji who were supposedly handling the case. But I couldn't get any information, and it was incredibly frustrating. Then finally, I managed to make contact with a new prosecutor on the case, and from then on, he kept me up to date with what was turning out to be a very complicated and difficult trial.
The prosecution strategy at the outset was quite straightforward. Here we have a very horrible crime, but we have a confession, so really quite a simple, compact, albeit traumatic trial to prosecute.
He gave himself up on Saturday, and Sunday afternoon I received a phone call from all the way from New Zealand, and there's someone whom I don't know, happens to be a Queen's Counsel. He said, you know, just agree that I'll come and fight up at his case.
I became involved because a friend of mine was very friendly with Apete, and so that's how the connection began. Apete had actually worked at the local store. In fact, I mean, he'd supplied, you know, my people from the farm here. In fact, he knew them all well. I mean, he was a very nice guy. Everyone liked him. There was a person who was always going out of his way to, you know, feed stray animals, was very, very compassionate, good sense of humour. Comes as a really sort of shock at the end of the day when there's an allegation like that for someone who would appear to a place it wouldn't hurt a fly.
When I first heard that this murder had happened at Tamavua, my first thought was, oh God, don't let the cops cock it up. The possibility of the investigation being botched was very real. And as it turned out, it was almost realised. For example, the Commissioner of Police, the then Commissioner of Police, who had no police training, he was ex-military, He leapt onto television, and I use the word leapt deliberately. He couldn't wait to get on television to announce that we will have a suspect arrested within an hour. And then he was required to come back an hour later and say, well, we'll have somebody by tonight.
And I know for a fact at that stage the investigation had nothing to go on. It was a embryonic investigation, so it was an outlandish thing to have suggested.
In the meantime, he had gone to the scene himself. And when his own officers, his scenes of crime officers, went in to take fingerprints at the scene, the only prints that they could find that were not those of John Scott and Scrivener were the Commissioner of Police's own fingerprints. So the Commissioner had gone in and completely violated all the rules of crime scene integrity and put his own great thumbprints all over the thing.
Some of the police officers who had been assigned as scene guards at the Scott house ended up stealing from the house. They ended up being prosecuted by my office. If you can't maintain integrity of your scene, what kind of forensic case can you actually mount?
I think it was bumbling, but I think it was bumbling because of certain beliefs.
I think it was a combination of lack of training, maybe not that keen on seeing someone like Apete face these charges. Some of the police officers clearly knew the family. They were very well known. I mean, there was probably a certain you're not being very popular being part of an investigative team trying to actually convict someone of a serious allegation like that. They knowing what the background was, and there's no two ways about it. The senior police officers weren't enthusiastic.
The police had identified a suspect prior to arresting Apete Kaisau and Nandi. They secured a confession from this second suspect, a confession that was corroborated by the scene. Effectively, the prosecution's task doubled in that I not only had to prove Apete's case beyond reasonable doubt, I had to disprove this other case, this other confession beyond reasonable doubt. We had to consider whether we had enough evidence to even continue.
A clever defense counsel can effectively say that there's so much confusion around the case and point out incompetence that it was possible that Apete Kaisau could have walked from the trial.
So the strategy post-depositions really was a second wave of retreat to wonder whether we can go forward with this prosecution at all in a realistic way. But our tortuous cogitating over all that was sort of swept away when insanity came on the horizon as an option.
For some time prior to the event, he was known to have been absorbed and almost obsessed with his religious convictions. His Bible had been read and reread, and material passages had been marked. Extracts from, about Sodom and Gomorrah and the immorality of homosexuality, and it was a huge focus.
Apparently there was even one Bible, he underlined a passage, "Thou shalt not worship false idols." And that was the association with John becoming famous during the coup.
The annotations that had been handwritten in that Bible were, I thought, disturbed ramblings of a disturbed mind. It was then that I put aside finally any reservations I had about Kaisau's state of mind.
A very common theme in cases like this is preoccupation with religious imagery and religious message. In a note that he penned, I can only assume shortly after the murders, he talks of doing God's work. He says, I hope I have done right unto you, or words to that effect, Father.
He said it was the voice of God. But there are voices talking to us every day. Peter was not able to discern which voice. And then he took the theological aspect of from the Old Testament, that if somebody was behaving this way, he need to be done away with. But that's not what Christ came to do.
It wasn't like a one-night thing. They picked this guy up and then he turned on them. No, they had a relationship, some form of a relationship. Well, I don't know whether it was a recognized threesome, but it was. He was definitely a big part of their lives for a little while.
We believe he had an intense hatred for the way they exploited not only him but other youths of Fiji to fulfill their desires.
Maybe he did have some gay tendencies or felt that he could be gay and needed to experiment and didn't like the answers he got.
Relationships with different power, different economic status, different even race in Fiji, knowing how all of those mix and meld together and how that has translated before, there are always issues around risk and ethics.
It's hard to put ethics and just because it was just such a way of life, and it still is such a way of life for not the whole gay community, but certainly a portion of it, and that behavior still happens. Yes, there's still ethics involved in it, but I certainly can't say whether it was right or wrong.
There's also a tradition of same-sex experimentation for younger men here. It's similar to what happens in Samoa, but not as institutionalized. Not everybody does it, and if you're willing to do it, I think that there's more than just the material part of it. There must be some other desire or motivating factor in it.
Court finds the accused Apete Kaisau not guilty of murder by reasons of insanity.
I thought the outcome of the trial was overwhelmingly satisfactory. We got the right man ostensibly wasn't sentenced as a convict, but sent to a psychiatric institution where he could receive appropriate care and treatment.
The insanity plea is sometimes, not an easy one for the victim's family to deal with, because it doesn't seem to really lead to justice in the end.
I thought that he had the rational capacity to make the decision. I think that was wrong. I thought he should have been found guilty, found guilty and convicted for murder.
Hollywood movie.
If you are mentally ill and you mix it with a bit of Christianity or any kind of fundamentalism, and if you've been involved in licentiousness, particularly homosexual licentiousness, that's a volatile cocktail. You know, your guilt can drive you into becoming the avenging angel for yourself and society, and I can see how easy it is to place yourself as a victim and then take power and protect everybody else by ending the source of your shame or your guilt.
I don't think justice was served in the end. It's created this lasting feeling that what he did was justifiable in a kind of bizarre way, you know? That people have the right to take into their own hands the moral judgment of this society and decide for themselves, without a court of law, that so-and-so is wrong and so-and-so is right. Yeah. It's the same thing that the commander's doing. He's decided that he knows what's best for us. Same thing what Kaisau did. And the society condones it and accepts it because the victims were gay men, living together openly. So it's that kind of mentality that is appalling, and that's the legacy this case has left us with.
I don't feel great anger or animosity towards Apete Kaisau. Incomprehension and sadness, perhaps. I've always thought that he was mentally unwell. I don't think he could have done what he did if he hadn't been unwell. 4 generations of my family now lie buried in Fiji. In some way, they've all left their mark. I can't help but be struck by something very circular in the story. There in the beginning was the Reverend William Weir Lindsay, encouraging Fijians to be good Christians and live according to the Bible. Then just over a century later, his great-grandson is murdered by a man quoting the same Bible to justify what he had done, believing he was following God's command. Fiji is very much in my blood, and like John, I'll always be drawn back. But it has to be to a place of the present and not the past.
Rongo rongo e bete me kaya manda bo aleko toka lao e na